This was the town of Belchite in Spain. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, it was left in its ruins to serve as a memorial to the devastation of Spain in one of the most savage civil conflicts Europe has ever seen. The Civil War lasted from 1936 to 1939. It cost perhaps 500,000 lives. It ruined cities, towns, and villages. For some, the victors, it was a crusade against godless revolution. For others, the defeated, it was a struggle against the forces of reaction that had oppressed Spain for generations. The Spanish Civil War still haunts the world's imagination. Many came to see it as the prelude to the Second World War, the first battle between democracy and fascism. Thousands of volunteers came to fight and die in a foreign land for ideals they believed to be their own. But the Spanish knew that the war had Spanish causes. It was, after all, their country that was ruined, their history that exploded. 40 years on, the dictatorship has dissolved, and the survivors can speak more freely. They can question some of the myths. They can evoke something of what they saw and understood during the Spanish Civil War. On July 17th, 1936, a group of army officers rebelled against the government of the Spanish Republic. Workers took up arms to fight the rising, and what began as a military coup led to almost 3 years of civil war. For both sides, political opponents became enemies. The Republic, the Niña Bonita, the beautiful girl. 5 years before the Civil War, joyful demonstrations throughout Spain agreed to the proclamation of the Republic. The monarchy had fallen without violence. To the crowds, the Republic meant that Spain had broken through to the 20th century, to progress, to a long-delayed victory for social and economic change.
It was
an April day, spring-like. It was a mild day with sunshine. So we walked, and there were huge throngs of people in lorries, the few cars that there were in those days, in trams. And then, unexpectedly and surprisingly, Republican flags appeared everywhere. Nobody knew where so many had come from.
While the crowds rejoiced, King Alfonso was spending his final hours in the royal palace. Only weeks before, he had led the solemn Palm Sunday ceremonies, unaware that the monarchy was doomed. Over the years, one part of Spanish society after another had lost faith in the monarchy. The middle class despised Alfonso XIII for tolerating a 7-year military dictatorship. The ruling classes now fear the king can no longer protect them. And for the workers out on the streets that day, the monarchy was the clamp, holding an oppressive system together. 2 days before, on April the 12th, royalist parties were heavily defeated in local elections. Suddenly the king understood his own isolation. While Spain rejoiced, he went unresisting into exile. The king was replaced by a government of mostly middle-class liberals, but their plans for an advanced democracy were out of step with history. Elsewhere in Europe, liberalism was weakened by economic depression, poisoned by dictatorship. The government was releasing huge forces in this tightly repressed society, the class hatreds of the agrarian poor and of the rapidly growing working class. Yet these Republican optimists and their socialist allies thought that orderly reforms would soon transform the nation. Justino de Azcárate was a member of that first Republican government of 1931.
There was this feeling of freedom. For many years, publications had been subject to censorship, and academic freedom had been restricted. Now there was a general trend towards freedom, and also new laws to create a social and economic order that would be more just and more egalitarian.
The farm laborers and the industrial workers, underpaid, almost unprotected, and frequently unemployed, hoped that the Republic would immediately end exploitation and break the power of the old ruling classes. Narciso Julián was a young socialist at the time.
La llegada de la República significaba para la clase obrera una gran esperanza.
The birth of the Republic brought great hope among the working class that their aspirations would be satisfied. That was the main feeling among industrial workers and peasants. For centuries, peasants had longed to own land. Industrial workers wanted their union rights recognized, the right to strike, to a fair salary, to social benefits that they didn't have, social security, and so on.
Sociales que no las tenía, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista de la seguridad social y de todas estas cuestiones, ¿no? Es decir, todos esos problemas económicos.
So here were all these social and economic problems that had to be solved. The arrival of a democratic regime, of the Republic, meant so much for a vast majority of workers, the hope that all these aspirations would come true.
A cumplir esas aspiraciones.
For many, the Republic seemed already the revolution. But the Republic's leaders knew that under the new political surface, the pillars of the old society remained untouched. A powerful and deeply conservative church hostile to change. An army accustomed to having the last word in politics. A possessing class determined to defend its privileges. Southern Spain, above all, was an area of big estates, rich landowners. Many were hated by the landless farm laborers, nearly 750,000 of them for whom daily survival was a struggle.
On the one side, there was a huge number of impoverished laborers, and on the other, a few landowners. And this meant tremendous humiliation, to the point where laborers here were hired as though they were cattle in a market.
It was virtual slavery because there were no fixed wages. They paid what they wanted to pay. In many families, children went to bed hungry because you didn't get paid enough. You weren't paid enough for subsistence.
The Republic knew that democracy might collapse if land was not divided more justly. But its complicated, cautious reforms disappointed farm workers while alarming the landlords.
Well, the main reason was that the Republic, right from the very start, was totally opposed to rural property. It campaigned against rural property. You see, under the Republic, more and more people believed in the slogan, neither property, nor God, nor bosses. And that's nearly revolutionary language. That's how it really was at the time. So it's quite natural that landowners would resist this. It's quite understandable.
The landless have an inborn desire to own land, so the Republican propaganda about land reform raised a lot of interest and immediate support. They felt very frustrated when reform didn't take place. So much so that they then tried to grab land. Well, they not only tried, they did occupy land.
The landless poor were impatient to take over the fields that the Republic hesitated to give them. Was there a chance for gradual change without violence? One land reform official, José Vergara, was soon disillusioned.
Yo creo efectivamente que es imposible hacer una reforma agraria sin revolución.
I believe that it is impossible to carry out an agrarian reform without a revolution which dismantles the existing political and social structures. In a country where the land is owned by a small group of people who constitute an influential social sector, you have to fight for the land. You will not be given it voluntarily. In the same way that those who do not have land fight for it, those who possess it fight to preserve it.
The turmoil in the countryside challenged the fabric of society and the church. Farm workers, like the urban poor, often saw the priest as the ally of the landowner or the factory owner. But the church still held the respect of the rich and powerful, and of many humble Spaniards as well. There was as much reverence as there was hatred. It was said that Spaniards always followed their priests with a candle or with a club. But anti-clericalism, a fanatical determination to break the hold of the Catholic Church over society, united liberal Republicans and socialists alike. It was a principle on which the Republic refused to compromise. Less than a month after the proclamation of the Republic, this resentment against the Church erupted in violence. Following a riot outside a royalist club, mobs set fire to half a dozen convents in Madrid.
Those were the churches where we had gone to Mass, had our first communion, and been baptized. Yes, the day the convents were burned was terrible, full of sadness and anguish. Our feelings were aggravated by the knowledge that it was being condoned. Nothing was done to stop it. The mobs were burning churches and convents, and nobody intervened. It was a terribly sad day.
As the convents were burned and looted, the police stood by and watched. Manuel Azaña, then Minister of War, said that day that all the churches in Spain were not worth one Republican life. Words like these were never forgotten or forgiven. Nearly half the population was illiterate. The Republican government set about building a non-religious state education system. The church's hold over minds was to be broken. In the first years of the Republic, nearly 10,000 schools were opened. Soon the Republic was taking art and culture to every corner of Spain. La Barraca was part of this offensive. The Spanish intellectuals were eager to act as the Republic's missionaries of enlightenment. Federico Garcia Lorca, poet and playwright, took the theatre to remote villages. In Calderon's classic, Life is a Dream, Lorca played the part of the shadow. He was to be one of the Civil War's first victims. This cultural upsurge also gave fresh energy to regions which felt themselves distinct from the rest of Spain. Catalonia and the Basque country above all retained a proud awareness of their own histories. Since the turn of the century, their demand for self-government had grown louder and angrier. As a student, Marcel Giraud supported the Catalan autonomist movement.
In the past, Catalonia had been an independent nation. We have a tradition of language, customs and culture very distinct from the rest of Spain. It's different at many levels. Added to this, there's the fact that we'd been dominated by outsiders who had shown no respect for our freedoms. Since the proclamation of the Republic on April the 14th, 1931, we'd been longing for these freedoms to be restored to Catalonia.
Like the Basques, the Catalans were more industrialized and prosperous than the rest of the country. Yet they had been stifling under the backward, over-centralized rule of Madrid. Barcelona, the Catalan capital, was the center of a thriving textile industry and a huge port. The Republic soon granted Catalonia home rule. The Catalans were encouraged to assert their national identity even more strongly. An army officer, Manuel Diaz Alegría, was among those who feared that home rule would lead to the breakup of the Spanish state.
The Catalans made silly mistakes, such as bothering people who went to Catalonia, telling visitors that they had to speak Catalan, things like that. All this created the impression that they might destroy the unity of the nation, given that they didn't hesitate to proclaim their separatist motives.
National unity obsessed army officers. Spain had already lost most of its world empire. In the Moroccan Wars of the 20s, it nearly lost one of its last foreign possessions. Francisco Franco helped to turn defeat into victory and became a general at the age of only 33. The Republic planned to reform the army, which was so archaic and top-heavy that there was one officer to every 11 soldiers. The army regarded these changes with heavy suspicion, but it was the grant of self-government to Catalonia, which conservative officers saw as the most immediate threat to the unity of the nation. August 10th, 1932. General Sanjurjo led an unsuccessful rising against the government. 16 months earlier, as commander of the police, he had decided not to resist the coming of the Republic. Now his action was a warning that the loyalty of the armed forces was coming under strain. General Sanjurjo was imprisoned, but the government allowed him to entertain his family and supporters. In Madrid, the government's victory over the rising was celebrated with parades and demonstrations in support of the Republic. The Sanjurjo rising was premature. The right wing and the traditional powers in Spanish society were not yet ready to overthrow the Republic, but they detested the reforms, and their alarm was growing. On the left, too, disillusionment was spreading. The hungry, the landless, the unemployed, and the underpaid were beginning to confront the state openly. One source of this left-wing opposition was anarchism, gathered round its trade union, the CNT, born during the bloody social conflicts of Barcelona in the early years of the century. The CNT's creed was anarcho-syndicalism, the belief that revolution would lead to total worker self-management. Although the anarchist movement had weakened in the rest of Europe, in Spain it had prospered. By 1932, the CNT claimed over 1 million members. Federica Montsegna was a young anarchist leader.
I believe there's something different, special about Spaniards, created by the mixture of so many different races, by their history, and by constant oppression. They were oppressed first by feudalism, then by an all-powerful bourgeoisie, by an army that has always cast its long shadow over Spain, by the pressure of the church. And all of this has created a constant spirit of rebellion among Spaniards. It has driven them towards ideas of emancipation, towards revolutionary concepts of society and of life.
When the Republic was proclaimed in 1931, the anarchists declared, "We remain in open war with the state." They rejected all governments, monarchies or republics. They fought for a society of equal, cooperating human beings, freed from the curses of private property, God, and bosses. In Spain, extremes of poverty created a climate ripe for revolutionary violence. In January 1933, anarchists led futile risings in several Andalusian villages. One of them was Casas Viejas. The police showed the villagers no mercy. Prisoners were shot. One house defended by anarchists was set alight, and the occupants died. The blame for these tragedies was put on the Republican leaders. The socialists decided to pull out of the government, disgusted at scandals like Casas Viejas, delaying the reforms, and mounting unemployment. New elections were called in 1933. The socialist left was now losing faith in the whole parliamentary system. The anarchists had never believed in it anyway. Most of the right had not yet rejected parliamentary democracy. They hoped that by winning the elections, they could still halt and reverse the whole tide of events. A new party emerged on the right. It was called the Theta. This was Spain's first mass Catholic party. Its leader was the ambitious young José María Gil Robles, who had learned from the campaign style of the Nazis. The right wing made a supreme effort to bring out its voters. It was helped by women who were voting for the first time. Ironically, it was the Liberal Republic that had given them the franchise. The elections of November 1933 made Theta the largest party in Parliament. Gil Robles became the hero of conservative Spain. The government shifted right. The reform program slowed down or went into reverse. The left was appalled. Behind Gil Robles, they suspected the shadow of fascism was waiting.
E oggi il popolo italiano e il regime fascista sono una unità compatta, infrangibile, formidabile, che può sfidare come sfida tutti i suoi nemici e anche plantare del peggio.
By 1934, fascism was reaching out across Europe. In Germany, the Nazis were crushing what opposition remained. The Spanish socialists were determined not to go down without a struggle. They imagined there would soon be jackboots on the streets of Madrid if Theta and Gil Robles took power. When Toledo did join the government in October 1934, the Spanish socialists decided to strike back. Sócrates Gómez was a member of the socialist youth.
Que había habido un proceso de regresión muy grave en la política española y que estábamos y éramos conscientes.
We felt there'd been a serious regression in Spanish politics, and we were well aware that even without a civil war, fascism could come to power in Spain, perhaps camouflaged behind politicians such as Gil Robles. And this is what led us to strike.
Y eso nos aconsejó el ir al movimiento huelguístico. You
must realize that this wasn't just another strike for things like wages or better working conditions. This was a revolutionary strike, and our aim was to overthrow the government and take power.
The socialists summoned the workers to rise against the elected government, but the insurrection was easily defeated everywhere, except in the northern mining district of Asturias. There, the whole left for once united in rebellion. Socialists and anarchists, communists and Trotskyists seized control and declared the revolution. The coal miners shut down their pits and marched out eagerly to fight for Red Asturias.
We felt this tremendous excitement. We had dynamite ready to blow everything up, and everybody was behind us. The whole village was ready to go, even the kids, men, women, children, everybody.
It was open war against the Madrid government. The miners drove back local army units and murdered some of their political enemies. But the government now sent Moroccan troops and the Spanish Foreign Legion into the battle. A fortnight after it had begun, the Asturias Rising had been broken. The fighting had ravaged towns and villages. General Franco helped to plan the government campaign. As the army fought its way along the Asturian valleys, the defeated miners were shown no mercy.
The civil guard did it, and the army troops, and some of the local bosses who went with them pointing out suspects. They said, this one, that one. That was it. That's what happened. They killed all sorts of people.
Nearly 2,000 people were killed in the Asturias Revolution, some of them slaughtered in cold blood. Tens of thousands were marched off to prison. In Spain as a whole, the socialist-led rising had failed to get off the ground because the left could not act together. But the lesson of Asturian unity sank home. Over the next 2 years, the left drew closer together as the government imprisoned opposition leaders and demolished their reforms. In 1936, with elections approaching once more, most of the left united in a popular front. The anarchists did not join, but supported the Popular Front in order to rescue their own imprisoned supporters. On the right, Gil Robles launched a noisy, confident campaign. He claimed that he alone stood between Spain and a murderous Bolshevik revolution. February the 16th, polling day, was a turning point in the history of Spain. As the results came in, it became clear that the Popular Front had won the largest block of seats. The release of political prisoners began. Dolores Ibarruri, known as La Pasinaria, had been elected as a communist MP for Asturias.
So then I went to the prison. The governor had run away, but his deputy was there. He said, "I haven't received any orders." I replied, I'm the MP for Asturias. I was beginning to sound very grand. I said, please give me the keys. The prisoners are coming out today. He finally said, here they are. So I ran along the corridors of the jail, shouting, comrades, all out. It was very moving.
All Barcelona turned out for the return from prison of Luis Companys, Catalonia's president. The working class parties refused to join the government. The left Republicans were now trapped between the panic of conservative Spaniards and the excited hopes of the workers. Strikes and land seizures broke out as workers tried to win back what had been lost in the last 2 years. As the prisoners marched out into the fresh air, the right concluded that Gil Robles' parliamentary politics had let them down. Conservative hopes now followed a new star, José Calvo Sotelo. But for some, the time for parliamentary compromise had already passed. Tomás Garicano Goñi was a young conservative officer.
I was not a member of any political party, but we felt there was no way out. As Gil Robles wrote later, peace was not possible. For me, this was only too true. And there's something else, perhaps too embarrassing to recall, but that one has to admit. At that time, we couldn't stand each other. Divisions and tensions had reached such a point that even seeing a socialist, not to mention a communist, was the same as seeing the devil.
Some 15,000 members of Gil Robles' youth movement defected and went over to the Falange, Spain's own fascist party, which had been founded by José Antonio Primo de Rivera in 1933. José Antonio insisted, even to audiences outside Spain, that he was not just copying fascism elsewhere.
The movement we are initiating in Spain is not a copy of any foreign movement. It has learned from fascism what fascism has of the idea of unity, authority, and substitution of the struggles among classes by the idea of cooperation.
The climate of violence allowed the Falange to flourish. José Antonio was arrested, and the Falange was banned. But they had helped to ensure that rioting and political murder became predictable when left and right collided. While men were using fists, stones, bullets to settle political arguments, they were also using direct action to escape from poverty. On the dry hills of Extremadura, the patience of the farm laborers now snapped. They surged out to occupy the land they had yearned for. On a single day, March 25, 1936, some 60,000 landless workers took over 3,000 farms. Revenge was in the air. The landowners feared that they could lose not only their estates, but their lives. And there was trouble brewing in Navarre, in the north of Spain, but this time from the right. The Carlists were traditional monarchists, whose catechism was God, fatherland, and king, their own Carlist king. Fanatically religious, they were locked into a medieval view of the world. The Carlists had rebelled against a liberal monarchy in the 19th century. Now they were eager to overthrow this godless Red Republic. Amid the growing breakdown in law and order, some army officers resolved that they must act. The government had sensed the danger and posted some of the most disaffected generals away from the mainland. General Franco was sent to the Canary Isles. But General Mola was unwisely posted to Pamplona in the Carlist country. From here, Mola, El Director, began the secret organization of the plot. At first, Mola encountered reluctance among some key figures. He had assigned to General Franco the job of launching the rising in Spanish Morocco. Franco would take command of the Moors and foreign legionaries he had led in the 1920s. But Franco hesitated to commit himself. Ramon Serrano Suñer was Franco's brother-in-law.
Franco pensó siempre en que había que estaba obsesionado.
Franco was obsessed with the danger of communism. He was convinced that communism had to be stopped, but he was in no hurry. He thought the danger wasn't so imminent, and he was quite happy staying in the Canary Isles.
May 1st, 1936. The parade was intended to show the Republic's enemies that the left had overwhelming strength. Largo Caballero, whom some call the Spanish Lenin, was the most extreme socialist leader. He was now calling for a revolution that would impose the dictatorship of the proletariat. The right was terrified. A mere spark could detonate the tension. During the parade, the cry went up that nuns had given poisoned sweets to the children. Crowds broke away and set fire to a convent. The government of the Republic was fighting desperately to stave off the collapse of the state itself, but the socialists still refused to join the coalition. The leadership of the Republic was now increasingly isolated. On June 16th, José Calvo Sotelo, the opposition leader, proclaimed himself in favor of a strong, integrated state, which would end strikes, lockouts, starvation wages, and anarchic liberty. He ended by saying, "Many call this a fascist state. If it is, then I, who share that idea of the state and believe in it, declare myself fascist." In Pamplona, July 7, 1936 brought the annual running of the bulls, the festival of San Fermin. The crowds of visitors were good cover for Mola's emissaries.
I received a message from a friend saying that they were all there having a good time and that I should join them as I had done in previous years. This was the coded message I was expecting.
As the bulls plunged about the ring, Mola and his plotters were solving their last problems. The rising had been postponed, as the Carlists squabbled about which flag they should march under, and some army officers still refused to betray the Republic. But Jose Antonio, after complaining that Mola's movement was too conservative for his radical fascism, had finally promised support. At last, Mola felt that he could go ahead.
I met Mola and he told me everything was ready, and the names of the officers who were assigned to each region.
Franco, still in the Canary Isles, got a message to Mola.
In the first days of July, July the 6th or 7th, Franco had sent a message to Mola, written on a piece of paper carried by a woman in her belt, saying, "Geography, Tetuan, insufficient."
Franco, devious and prudent, was still calculating his own chances.
This really upset Mola, el director. He was very irritated. He said, "Franco will never get here in time. It will all be delayed, and the government is going to break it all up."
But the plan to ferry Franco to Morocco went ahead. The search for the right ferryman ended in the home counties, at Croydon Airport. Captain Bebb, a freelance pilot, was introduced to a gentleman from Spain.
And he asked me if I was prepared to go to the Canary Islands to get a RIF leader to start an insurrection in Spanish Morocco. I thought, what a delightful idea. What a great adventure.
On July 11th, Captain Bebb took off from Croydon. By the night of the 12th, he had got as far as Casablanca on his way to the Canary Isles. But it was what happened in Madrid that night that unlocked the last gate to disaster. It began here, at the home of Lieutenant José Castillo. He was a left-wing officer in the Assault Guards, the Republic's own police force. His life had several times been threatened by right-wing extremists. It was nearly 9:30 at night. Castillo was leaving home to go on duty at the police station, no more than a 10-minute walk. He got no further than the corner. News that Castillo had been murdered soon reached the police station. Outraged, his comrades demanded that all right-wing extremists should be rounded up. Headquarters sent them a list. It was Lieutenant Leon Lupion who gave out the names to the arrest squads.
A los oficiales que había por aquí les fuimos entregando.
I handed out 2 or 3 names to each of the other officers, and they went off in police vans with several guards.
A esa misión. Y al final de todo, en esta
And
parte,
finally, there was just one van left in the corner there, van number 17.
Van 17 was the last to set out, at 3 in the morning. Nobody knows who was on its list for arrest. All that is clear is that a van arrived at the home of the leader of the opposition, the right-winger José Calvo Sotelo. They asked him to step down to the station for questioning. He promised to telephone soon to his family, unless, he added, these gentlemen blow my brains out. His dead body was dumped at the gate of the East Cemetery. It was not the authorities who had ordered his arrest, but there was no way the government could escape the blame. The leader of the opposition had been assassinated in the custody of the government's own special police. The Calvo Sotelo murder brought the fury of conservative Spaniards to its peak. Its timing, a malign coincidence, offered the army plot mass support at a crucial moment.
Entonces, todas las dudas y vacilaciones que aún existían.
It was then that all the doubts and hesitation about whether to call the uprising immediately or to wait for the disintegration to spread so that we would be more justified, all those doubts disappeared.
Within hours of the murder, Muller dispatched a coded telegram. It read, "On the 15th last, at 4 a.m., Helen gave birth to a beautiful child. Hidden here were the date, time, and place of the uprising. July 18th, at 5 a.m., in Morocco." The Republican government knew that Spain was close to explosion, but it failed to take seriously the approaching spark, the military uprising. The left knew all too well what was coming, and the workers were already garrisoning party and trade union offices. At midnight, the socialist leader, Indalecio Prieto, with some of his colleagues, met the Prime Minister, Casares Quiroga. They had begged him to arm the people, but Casares thought this would fling away the last hopes of law and order. He refused. At dawn, on July 14th, Captain Bebb took off from Casablanca. Destination, the Canary Isles. That same morning, the funerals of Castillo and Calvo Sotelo took place. Clenched fists for Castillo's coffin. The straight-arm fascist salute for Calvo Sotelo. What remained of political middle ground in Spain was crumbling. Disaster now seemed inevitable. Juan Molina was an anarchist militant in Barcelona.
We hadn't slept at home for several nights. We were grabbing what sleep we could on floors of the Union and our newspaper offices. We were waiting for the inevitable. In our newspapers, we were telling our members to be prepared. Everybody was ready because we knew the coup was bound to come.
Josep Tarradellas, the Catalan leader, called on the Prime Minister, but Casares Quiroga still refused to see what was about to happen.
While we were chatting, news arrived of army unrest in Morocco. There were reports that some generals were about to rise, although General Franco's name still wasn't being mentioned. So then I told him, my friend Casares, I'm convinced that the army is going to rise against Spanish democracy. He said, I'm sure it won't.
Casares Quiroga could not believe the generals would go so far. But on July 17th, the day before it was planned, the rising erupted here in Melilla. Next day it spread to other towns in Morocco, even before General Franco had arrived to lead the Army of Africa. The military plotters assumed that their coup d'etat would succeed swiftly. The government of the Republic, in turn, thought it was strong enough to stamp out this erratic rising. Both were terribly wrong. The rising spread to the mainland, and the rebel generals soon controlled great tracts of the countryside. But the workers were now at last given arms, and with loyal police units they defeated the military in most of Spain's industrial cities. There could be no rapid victory either way. The rising swelled into full-blown counter-revolution. On the other side, the workers, now pouring out to the barricades, were using their rifles for a Spain which was to become not just republican, but revolutionary. There was no way left to prevent the conflict which was to rage across Spain for almost 3 years. There could be no more negotiation, no compromise. It could only be civil war. The war memorial in this small village in southern Spain bears the names of 95 civilians and local police. It was built in General Franco's time. It records the victims killed here behind the lines on just one side of Spain's civil war. Many died on the other side too, but their memorial had to wait until Franco was dead, 40 years after the war. Only then was it safe to admit you had opposed him. This mass grave of anonymous civilians who died in the terror that followed Franco's uprising was organized by one of the survivors.
They are working men and women that are buried here, that were shot here. While the war lasted, there was no memorial, it was a rubbish dump. We can't be sure exactly how many died, but from their relatives, we reckon there are about 500 bodies.
the Civil War became the battlefield for international ideologies. Before then, it was Spain's own revolution and counter-revolution. Justice was swept away by random brutality. Historians say the war's dead could be as many as 500,000. Half of them died in battle, the rest died by assassination, summary execution, or massacre. In 1936, Spain was a republic. But in July that year, a group of right-wing generals tried to overthrow the government. Much of Spain was still deeply conservative and welcomed the army revolt. It was only 5 years since the Spanish monarchy had fallen. Democracy to Spain was new and desperately fragile. There had been several attempts to undermine it, but so far democracy had survived. The inspiration for this new army plot was General Mola. He had planned a swift coup d'etat, but it didn't come off. Around the country, some sections of the army stayed loyal to the Republic. So did half the Spanish people. The pattern for the division of Spain was set. At the center of the plot in Pamplona, traditional monarchists and fascists joined the army rebels. So did the Civil Guard. But conservative Pamplona was very different from other parts of Spain. In Barcelona and Valencia, the rising was uncertain and disorganized, and workers took to the streets to help the loyal Republican police put down the rebellion. In conservative towns like Burgos, Valladolid, and Salamanca, the rising succeeded. But in Valladolid, only after local fascists had helped the army overcome workers' resistance. In those days, Spain's best troops were the colonial army of Africa, commanded by one General Francisco Franco in Morocco. The rebel Franco needed transport for his Moorish troops and a base on the mainland. It was provided when General Capo seized Seville and secured the vital bridgehead. The troops were taken there by German planes. In the capital, Madrid, the army rebels stayed in their barracks awaiting reinforcements. There was much civilian resistance to the revolt, but the Republican government hesitated. They feared the consequences of arming the people. The coup had missed the swift victory it had expected. The workers fought back. The coup became a civil war, and the resistance became a revolution. Lorca del Rio, 30 miles from Seville, was typical of hundreds of villages in southern Spain. The uprising took it by surprise.
All we knew was that the train from Seville did not arrive. There were rumors that there was trouble in Seville, but nobody knew for sure. I remember that on the morning of the 19th, everybody, well, not everybody, but the workers asked, "What's happening?" And there was a lot going on in the streets. People were wearing their party badges, some with shotguns on their shoulders.
I was working in the harvest when one of my brothers came and said, "Listen, Manolita, the revolution has broken out." "But what revolution is this?" "It was on the 18th of July, he said. So everybody left the harvest and came to town.
This is the man, Manuel Vázquez Guillén, who a generation later organized the village war memorial. He was a socialist, so were most of the laborers and peasants of Lora del Rio. This wasn't especially meaningful. The villages all around were political one way or another. But at the army rebellion, they all responded the same way. They set up revolutionary committees in the town hall to defend their villages against the soldiers setting out from Seville. They also seized the goods of the well-to-do and shared them out.
Entonces salió un camión, iba recogiendo toda la existencia en todas las tiendas, todos los comercios. Y se concentraron todos en un
A truck went out to all the shops, requisitioning all the merchandise. Everything was put together in a store, and all the people had to go there. Everybody was treated alike by the committee. Everybody got the same quantities per person, so many grams of rice, chickpeas, or meat. For meat, instead of killing animals, which we might later need for our work in the fields, we took the fighting bulls. We went and took the bulls because we didn't need entertainment. We only wanted food for the villagers, and we didn't want to use the cattle which were needed for working the land.
Some people had never seen the color of cooked meat. They had seen it at the butcher's, but never cooked. Very soon, people became tired of eating meat.
Lora del Rio's revolution had its more unpleasant aspects. Right-wingers and landlords were locked up in the village jail. They were accused of rebellion.
Some of the people who were taken were good people who gave work to everybody. Others were very bad. But they all ended up the same way. All the right-wingers were put in jail. All whom they believed to be on the right were also put in jail.
There was a lot of hatred. Throughout many years of struggle between workers and masters, a lot of hatred had been accumulated.
For generations, Spain had been a land of injustice, hunger, and hate. This hate was not only in the countryside. In Barcelona, the rising gave the authorities a double problem. The city was the center of a popular anarchist movement, unique in Europe, that denied the principle of government authority of any kind. The anarchists had more than 500,000 supporters all over the country. To them, the army represented all the forces of reactionary Spain. So they took to the streets against the rebels and thus, by coincidence, found themselves in common cause with the loyal forces of law and order for the first time. It was a combination bound to have dramatic consequences. Anarchists led crowds of people to urge the loyal police force to attack army divisional headquarters, where the local rebel leader, General Godet, was holding out. When he finally gave in, his surrender was broadcast throughout Spain. It encouraged resistance everywhere to the army coup. The anarchists stormed the artillery depot. The government tried to contain the situation by sending loyal civil guards, but crowds of people seized substantial quantities of weapons. For the first time in Barcelona, the people armed themselves. This was a serious dilemma for the authorities of Catalonia. The region was governed by liberal politicians, the voice of the middle class. But the rebellion had been put down by anarchists with other working class support and the police force. The politicians had kept their heads down. Catalonia's president, Luis Companys, faced the situation virtually alone, apart from his police chief, Federico Escofet.
I went to see the president and I said, all right, the rebellion has been put down. There's only the odd patch of local fighting, but of minor importance. And then he said, all right, yes, Escofet, that's fine. But the CNT-FI now rule the streets.
The CNT-FI armed anarchist organizations dominant in the streets made the government powerless. This was the awful dilemma. If the legitimate administration wanted to restore its normal authority, Escofet's men would have had to turn on the very comrades in arms who had helped save the Republic. What happened in Barcelona was critical for the development of the war. The right-wing army rebellion had created a revolutionary fervor of resistance. The army surrender in Barcelona released forces that the ordinary democratic republic could not contain. While the rebellion's defeat in Barcelona was the Republic's first victory of the war, Madrid, the capital, was in suspense. On the morning of the 19th of July, the new Prime Minister, Giral, had at last given the order to arm the people. The socialist and anarchist trade unions were issued with 65,000 rifles, but only 5,000 rifles have bolts, and you cannot fire a gun without its bolt. The missing parts were in the Montaña barracks in a dominant, threatening position near the center of Madrid. The commander refused to hand them over, so the barracks were stormed. Very soon the white flag appeared. One section of the barracks seemed to want to give up, but firing continued from another section.
People were pissed off about the way the rebels had used a white flag and deceived them. Many people had been killed because of that. So when they finally entered the barracks and saw an officer surrender, they shot him. It was a logical reaction, wasn't it?
The uprising was defeated in 5 out of Spain's 7 largest cities. They stayed loyal to the Republic. It was different with the conservative Catholic peasantry. They supported the army coup. There were 2 Spains now. Republicans held the north and a vast area southeast of Madrid. The rebels held the area north of the capital and the southwest. From both zones, columns of troops and armed civilians rushed to confront the opposition. The tactics of both sides were crude, informed only by passion. From Madrid and Barcelona to defend the Republic, from the conservative hinterland to crush it.
Once they had more or less cleared Madrid of resistance, they decided to go out to the mountain passes to halt the advance of the column heading our way. And it was all still very festive. The first days, it was like a great party. A party in honor of the revolution, you might say. And I remember how people called each other. Early in the morning, you would hear voices. Manolo, Paco, Antonio, and the windows would open. I'm coming. And he'd do up his overalls, put on his cap, fix his cartridge belt, and climb into the lorry and head off to the hills to fight the war, and then come back for the night. They used to return home to sleep. And the women would say, Paco's gone off to the front today, and I made him a potato tortilla, and he's taken a few bottles of wine. People went off to the front as though it was a picnic.
The casual gaiety of Republican volunteers from Madrid was matched by the enthusiasm with which civilians who supported the rebels set off to try to capture the city. Among them was Juan Crespo.
Nos comprábamos el monos, que era el uniforme, íbamos al cuartel, allí nos daban...
We bought overalls for our uniform. We went to the barracks where they gave us our ammunition belts and the rifles.
Un camión y a tomar café a Madrid. No, era, pues, era una farsa.
We thought it was going to be such a walkover that we joked we were going for a coffee in Madrid. Like someone going to a dance. Because that's what it was for us. As well as being a bit of a trip, it was going to a dance. It was as if there was a competition between the columns setting off from different points. From Burgos, from Pamplona, from Valladolid, from Salamanca. We were all heading for Madrid, and the race was to see who would get there first. As if there were only 300 cups of coffee waiting. We came back from the front whenever we liked. Then we'd hand in our rifles and calmly go home. Nobody stopped us because we weren't dressed as soldiers. And we weren't soldiers. We weren't formally enlisted. Of course, that soon ended. General Mola turned us into soldiers, put us under military authority. But at the beginning, it didn't exist.
As the man said, General Mola had to turn his insurgent irregulars into some kind of disciplined body. They became one force and called themselves Nationalist. On the other side, of course, the Republicans too had to become a proper fighting force, but that was more difficult. Each political party or trade union recruited its own volunteers into the militia units. Anarchist columns under leaders like Durruti fiercely defended their independence. By definition, anarchists had to oppose organized militarism. They would defend the Republic against the fascists, but not at the expense of surrendering to any sort of authority, otherwise they could hardly be anarchists. In any case, defending the Republic was not enough. After successfully resisting the army's coup in the cities, they now took the offensive. The war provided the opportunity to achieve a freedom and justice that they argued was impossible under bourgeois democracy. They claimed that war and revolution were inseparable.
War had been imposed on us because we were being attacked, and the revolution was to rebuild society according to our ideals. We weren't going to give our lives for capitalism. We were giving them for the revolution. This is how I felt about it, and most of the others.
"200 miles from the front, Barcelona was now anarchy itself. Governmental authority had gone. The anarchists were the only power, but since they opposed all authority, they logically refused to take power themselves. Instead, their leaders chose to share control of Catalonia in a committee of anti-fascist militias, while the rank and file made their revolution at the roots of society.
The
whole of the wood industry, for instance, the factories, all the forests, were taken over by the Union. Those bosses who hadn't fled to France stayed in their homes because there'd been 17 or 18 murders among the bosses. The Union said, let's collectivize it all. And then there was a kind of takeover, and they created what was called socialized wood industry. The first thing that was done was something rather strange, but it was something the workers had never managed to get, and that was healthy working conditions in the workshops. 80 or 90 small workshops were closed because they didn't have enough lighting or ventilation, or the machinery was unsafe. Big production units were created instead.
Industry was collectivized. Women were liberated. Abortion was legalized. Barcelona celebrated its freedom. This was a revolution. It had a dark side, too. The revolution found its enemies within. First, the church, the symbol of authority, the enemy of individuality. In Spain, a dreaded hierarchy. 13 bishops died in the revolution, and nearly 6,000 priests, nuns, and monks. This appalled the religious in what was still nominally a Catholic country. It fueled nationalist propaganda against the godless republic. the tombs of nuns were sacked. But atrocity was common to both sides. The general's coup had let loose an orgy of reciprocal vengeance. For the Nationalists, General Moller had set the tone from the beginning. He said, "It is necessary to spread an atmosphere of terror. We have to create an impression of mastery. Anyone who is overtly or secretly a supporter of the Popular Front must be shot." The Spanish War had barely begun when the London Daily Express correspondent in Republican Madrid was told by his colleague from the Times that victims of the terror could be found in the grounds of the university.
Just outside the Faculty of Philosophy, I saw the first bodies. They were lying, some in pairs, some singly, scattered all over the... As a journalist, I naturally wanted to find out what was going on. So I went to see the head of the Communist Commission of Investigation.
In the vacuum of authority left by the uprising and revolution, the political parties had set up their own so-called investigation committees. In the absence of official bodies of law and order, their function was not just investigation, but the brutal administration of justice.
Madrid and Barcelona and the other cities were left virtually without any police whatsoever. At the same time, during the first riotous days of the revolution, the prisons had been thrown open, the warders had walked out, and hundreds, if not thousands of criminals had gained their liberty.
The random terror of Republican Spain was matched in the Nationalist zone. But here the methods were systematic and justified as a crusade to purify Spain. A lawyer called Francisco Payatas López escaped from Republican Madrid to the Nationalist zone. He saw the crimes of both.
No ha pasado en una zona nada que no haya pasado en la otra.
Nothing happened in one zone that didn't in the other. Nobody committed a crime which the other side didn't also perpetrate. The big difference was that in the red zone it was popular fervor which spilled over and killed people. On the other side it was those in authority who coldly condemned people to injustice. The moral difference is striking, because it's one thing for an ignorant populace to do something spontaneously, another thing for people in authority to carry something out coldly, bloodily, talking about a holy crusade in God's name, which is blasphemy, because God cannot condone anything like that.
As far as anyone knows, God was not consulted. Nobody seemed to mind. At the beginning, outside Valladolid, 40 Republican prisoners were shot every dawn. It became spectator sport. An opportunist vendor set up a snack bar. The Nationalist authorities rationalized their brutalities by the obligation to purge the motherland of alien ideologies, atheistic, Masonic, Marxist, or for that matter, liberal. Hamas never shrieked the propaganda. Nor was this modern Inquisition concerned only with politics. Federico García Lorca was the avant-garde of an artistic renaissance. Conservatives thought that his themes, sexual freedom, justice, and compassion, undermined the moral fabric of Spain.
Se le vio caminando entre fusiles por una calle larga, salir a campo frío aún con estrellas de la madrugada. Mataron a Federico cuando la luz asomaba.
Lorca died in his hometown, Granada, where, out of a population of 150,000, there were more than 4,500 deaths. Dozens of the town's leading intellectuals were shot at the cemetery wall. Lorca was not a revolutionary, or even a politician. His death, like so many of them, was meaningless. 3 days after the uprising, Lorca had fled his family home for the supposed safety of a nationalist friend's house. 2 weeks later, he was arrested and without trial or sentence, sent by the authorities to his death. The last sight of Lorca was with a truckload of other victims on the road to their anonymous execution in the hills outside Granada. No one knows who pulled the trigger. It's believed that Lorca now lies beneath this olive tree in an unmarked grave. The nationalist terror was ferocious and from their point of view necessary. There was stalemate across the mountains north of Madrid, so the nationalist strategy to capture it now involved the Army of Africa sweeping from the south across vast areas of Republican Spain. The working class population was hostile. They had to be cowed. From his base in Seville, General Capo de Llano roared nightly threats to what over the radio he called the Republican rabble. On the 25th of July, he announced, "Let it be known, for every right-wing person killed in the villages, I shall kill 10, and perhaps exceed this proportion." This was to prove no idle threat. In Lora del Rio, the Andalusian village where the revolution had brought the people meat for the first time, and local right-wingers had been arrested, time was catching up. The Civil War's justice of vengeance was underway. Further down the valley, nationalist troops were advancing. In village to village, anyone who resisted was summarily shot.
The nationalist troops had left Seville for the villages, and wherever they went, they just cleaned the place up. They dealt with anybody they wanted to. This one, boom, dead. I know about you, Paco, bang. No procedures were followed. A simple accusation was enough.
The threatening advance created panic in Lora del Rio. The village prison records show that as the nationalist troops advanced, all the right-wingers who had been locked up were taken out and handed over to the Revolutionary Committee. Entregado al Comité. The same names on the graveyard memorial show what those words meant. Anyone delivered to the Committee for Justice was shot. When the nationalists took the village, the killing began again. The prison records for the following weeks tell the other side of the war's history of reciprocal revenge.
I didn't see anything. No, I heard it. It was such a scandal. I heard the trucks pass and the shots, and more trucks and more shots. They swept them all away. I lived on that street, along by the railway line. You can see that the cemetery is very near. It's there where those trees are. So we could hear, especially in the silence of the night. When we heard the trucks passing at 3 a.m., we knew what it was.
Rojo means red. To the nationalists, all opponents were red, and if captured, shot. Local landowners in Andalusia joined the nationalist columns.
Mis motivaciones para empuñar las armas es que nos habíamos levantado.
We had risen against something we considered disastrous for the country, because they were killing our relatives, attacking our farms.
Nuestra familia que nos asaltaban nuestras fincas. Para mí, pues, la liberación de mi país.
For me, it meant the liberation of our country. For me, it was the war against communism. In my heart, I was anti-communist. You see, it wasn't against the Republic as such. It was a question of communism or not. In this country, there was a red revolution. As an individual, a worker may be good, bad, or indifferent, the same as a boss, the same as a businessman, the same as anybody, and yet collectively they're terrible. The workers as an entity will always be selfish. They have never considered the country's well-being as a whole.
That sort of hatred is past reason or compromise. Moreno de la Cova and other landowners joined the columns making their way through Andalusia to avenge their murdered families, reclaim their lands snatched by the revolution, to execute the Red Resistance. While the nationalist columns were wiping up opposition in the rear, the Army of Africa, Franco's Moors, marched along the road to Madrid. They took Merida in the first proper battle of the war. This linked them with the nationalists in the north. Ahead lay Madrid, but the frontier town of Badajoz, with a garrison loyal to the Republic, was cut off. The battle for Badajoz was ferocious. The Army of Africa, the Moors and the Foreign Legion won a bloody victory at great cost of life. First on the scene after the battle was Portuguese journalist Mário Neves.
It was terrible. The Moors were capable of anything. I suppose they were excited since they had come all the way from Morocco, had flown over the Strait of Seville, and had fought violent battles on the way to Badajoz. An officer warned us not to speak to the legionnaires because they were so violent. A column of some 120 men in a state of total madness arrived at these walls and advanced only to be crushed by gunfire.
Once the legionnaires had breached the defenses, they went berserk. Neves followed their rampage. 45 years later, he returned for the first time.
People were trying to escape, and they usually tied a white handkerchief round their left arm.
But
the rebels, who were looking for fighters, pulled their shirts, or rather tore them away violently, to find the mark left by the gun. As they had been fighting a lot, the gun left a black mark, and this was enough for them to be immediately arrested and to endure the fate we all can guess.
They herded them into the bull ring. No trials, of course, no inquiry, no questions. Just the swift bullet.
I wanted to go to the bull ring where people had told me there were several prisoners and piles of bodies. I tried to get into the bull ring, and I succeeded. I talked to the guards and noticed that there were now just 2 bodies left in the middle of the ring, but I realized then that there were still several prisoners in the bullpens. But I was so disturbed, I did not want to talk to them. They were obviously awaiting their final moment.
It was said that more than 2,000 people were summarily shot by firing squad. Mário Neves got over his nausea and became a reporter again.
I immediately tried to find out who were the authorities in the town, who was in charge. It turned out to be Colonel Yagüe, and I told him that everybody was talking about the shootings with horror. He expressed a certain indifference, and I asked him whether shootings were taking place, and if so, how many. I added that I had heard that 2,000 people had been shot. He looked at me, hesitated, and replied, "Probably not that many." But something in the way he said it left no doubts about the truth of the stories, which had already spread all over town.
3 days later, Yagüe was interviewed by an American reporter. Yagüe had his own estimate of the killings. "Do you think I was going to take 4,000 red prisoners," he said, "while my column marched against the clock? Of course we shot them. Should I have left them free behind me to let Badajoz become a red town again?" The terror did not end with the battle. A month later, prisoners were still being executed in the bullring. To be a Republican in Badajoz was to ask for death. Such a one was the husband of Teresa Villalobos. He was the town photographer.
I don't mind saying it. He was a Republican. When the Republic was declared, he was the first to put out the flag. He said, "Let's go back to Badajoz." He said, "I don't think they'll detain me, even though I'm left-wing. I certainly don't think they'll kill me or anything." So we came back and they caught him. Well, of course, they jailed him, and I went to look for him. I said, "What's up?" He didn't do anything. He wasn't with the fighters or anything. That was wasted effort, and they took him to the bullring. My father-in-law and I went to the bullring to see him. I went in and there was a window, but I couldn't go near him, or he near me. But he stretched out his hand, and I kissed it, and he kissed mine. But I couldn't go near him to kiss his face. His face was like yellow wax. He had big blue eyes. His eyes were glued on me and his father, and it was pitiful to see him. He said, "Father, these are the worst moments of my life. Do what you can, because they'll kill me." We went away because the guards said we couldn't talk anymore and had to wait till the morning. Then we went to the cemetery.
In Madrid, the news coincided with the first air raids on the capital. Together they provoked a new wave of spontaneous vengeance against anyone suspected of nationalist sympathy. Prime targets were right-wing political prisoners in the city's Modelo jail. A fire broke out in the prison, either started by political prisoners trying to escape or by common criminals egged on by the anarchist militias who had taken charge of one wing of the jail. However that may be, the consequence was tragic. A crowd gathered and herded the prisoners out of their cells. Socialists protested, but shootings began.
They picked people out, took them outside, and we could hear shots. It was like a scene from the French Revolution. There was a table with some candles tucked in bottles, and they had a tribunal of men and women there, dressed in overalls and wearing strange hats.
Raimundo Fernandez Cuesta was a member of the Fascist Party. Another prisoner was Ramon Serrano Suña, General Franco's brother-in-law. Another was Don Melquiades Alvarez, a former speaker of the Spanish Parliament.
They grabbed him, and he turned round to us and said, "To spend all my life defending the people, to end up in this way, to finish like this." And he said goodbye. A very short while afterwards, we heard shots from one of the cellars under the gallery itself. That's where they killed him, and the others.
In outrage at the atrocity, some European ambassadors threatened to recognize the army rebel government. Socialist leader Prieto said that night could lose them the war. Prime Minister Hirel wept. President Otaña wished himself dead. The revolution had swept away formal courts, but the Modelo tragedy made some system of justice imperative. New courts were set up. The rebels were allowed lawyers in what were called popular tribunals, and they began to curb the worst excesses of revolutionary justice. The absence of clear authority had also meant setbacks for the Republic at the front. Franco's army took Talavera, a step nearer Madrid. In the north, General Moller cut that branch of the Republic off from any chance of supply from France by capturing Irún. On the Aragon front, the Republican columns failed to take Zaragoza. The revolution was underway in the rear guard, but at the front, the Republican militias were getting beaten. Enrique Lista, a commander of the 5th Regiment, was trained in Moscow.
No eran efectivas porque las milicias no obedecían realmente.
The militias were not effective because they didn't really obey the general staff. They took their lead from unions, from political parties. They were not effective militarily from the point of view of fighting a regular organized army, such as we were facing at the front. The other side had brought forces from Africa. They had some of the best military units at their disposal, and regular units of foreign armies were starting to arrive. Later, of course, there were Italian troops and the German Condor Legion.
Fuerzas italianas y de la Legión Condor que comenzaron a llegar muy pronto.
We couldn't face up to them at the front with party or union militias which didn't obey orders, who, whenever they received an order, had to hold a general assembly to decide whether or not they would obey it.
En asamblea para acordar si acataban o no acataban la orden.
As the Republic's war effort flagged and failed, the Prime Minister Giral resigned. Largo Caballero, the socialist trade union leader, replaced him with a government which included communists for the first time. As Prime Minister and War Minister, Largo tried to bring the fragmentary and fragmented revolution under control and to centralize the war effort. In one instance, at least, it was too late. At Toledo, the Republican militias had besieged the local army rebels who had occupied the old Arab fort, the Alcata. The siege was a shambles.
There was absolutely no discipline whatsoever in their attack. People would come out on Sundays, for example, and they were allowed, ordinary people from Madrid, out for the weekend, would drive in lorries or cars if they had them, and they took a pot shot at the Alcazar. They were very proud of being able to go back to Madrid and say they had done so.
Prime Minister Largo Caballero was getting desperate. He tried to end the siege by having miners dynamite the rock on which the Alcata stood. It didn't work. Within 10 days, the garrison was relieved by Franco's efficient troops, and the Republicans retreated. Franco made a meal of the Alcata. It had delayed his attack on Madrid. But Toledo made him a hero. Within days, he became Generalissimo, Commander-in-Chief, and then Head of State in the Nationalist zone. With Franco poised for a final offensive, refugees fled Madrid. Less than 4 months after the start of the war, the government itself evacuated to Valencia. That left the usual vacuum of authority and a familiar pattern of atrocity. The militias in charge of the jails feared that prisoners would escape in the nationalist assault. They began to move them out in lorries along the road to Valencia, but the prisoners never arrived. The militias controlling the convoy made them stop at Paracuellos, 15 miles outside Madrid. There, more than 1,000 men, mainly captured rebel officers, were shot and dumped in mass graves. The executions continue for days. It cannot be doubted the authorities knew. Even the anarchist director of prisons protested, but nothing could stop the killing. The Spanish Civil War, like any other, unleashed the passions of centuries of hatred. There were humane protests and profound individual acts of mercy. But until the vacuum of authority in the Republican zone was filled and the systematic nationalist purge exhausted, the killing was unrestrained. And still the war was only 4 months old. And still the international brigades were on their way to Madrid. And that city's resistance would continue the war another 2.5 years.
When I see the animals and the dead people in the picture, I remember that night when I went along the road to Guernica, after we left the air raid shelters. It was full of dead animals and people covered in sacks, dead.
I have always been filled with emotion to see that woman burning on the balcony with her arms outstretched. I think she could be my grandmother.
Picasso's painting, Guernica. For two survivors, the town's bombing in the Spanish Civil War is a personal memory, but for nearly 50 years it has echoed in the conscience of the world. Spain, in the 1930s, was in many ways still struggling out of the 19th century, but it found itself the arena and battlefield for ideologies of the 20th. Men and women from all over the world fought for dreams of democracy, or communism, or fascism. Those ideas were later given a bitter, new meaning by the hindsight of global conflict and the Cold War. Europe in 1936. Hitler had been in power for 3 years. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922. In Russia, Stalin had begun the show trials and purges of his enemies. Democracy everywhere was on the defensive. Britain and France were fearful of a European war. Then came the news from Spain.
All is turmoil in turbulent Spain, and the cost of political anarchy is death and destruction. This unhappy country, reft into two almost equal camps, illustrates all the tragedies of civil war under modern conditions. Innocent people lose their lives, property of law-abiding citizens is wrecked, and half the combatants fight half-heartedly for one cause or the other because they're forced to take sides. Such is the fruit of anarchy, of a people divided against itself.
The newsreels, as usual, had a simple explanation: anarchy. But in truth, Spain's crisis confused many an outsider. To understand it, they translated the peculiarly Spanish issues into their own. Spain became Europe's obsession.
The idea of the Spanish liberalism and the Spanish workers, the Spanish people, seemed a very passionate and pure cause. I remember that my Oxford tutor, who was a philosophy tutor, said that it was the only course in his lifetime in which there seemed a complete choice, absolute choice, between good as represented by the Spanish Republic and evil as represented by the Francoist forces.
The convictions of Europe's left were matched by their enemies on the right. Renzo Lodoli was an Italian fascist.
Mi sembrava che in Spagna fosse necessario difendere il cristianesimo, che era insidiato.
I thought that in Spain it was necessary to defend Christianity. It was under siege. We thought that fascism was valid as a social and political doctrine. So it was our duty to go and help those who wanted more or less the same thing as we did.
Immediately, both sides sought and found gestures of support from rival sponsors abroad. In the liberal democratic world, individual sympathy for the plight of the Spanish Republic was widespread, but practical help from governments was to prove a different matter. The army rebels' pleas, on the other hand, were soon answered. Franco was not, at that time at least, a fascist. He was a conservative monarchist, but he was immediately assisted by European dictators who were fascists, and so he was inevitably identified with their kind of political despotism. Nevertheless, there is no evidence of any international fascist complicity in the Spanish general's original coup. On the contrary, in the summer of 1936, Hitler's thoughts were far from Spain. He was building a war machine for his own purposes, expansion in the east, and the repression of his opponents inside Germany. Hitler promised Britain that Germany wouldn't get involved in Spain. It was the first example of double talk in the Civil War, saying one thing and doing the opposite. Hitler had already sent aid. 2 days after the Spanish uprising, Franco had appealed to the Führer for help. After considering the consequence of a communist-influenced government controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, Hitler decided to send not the few anti-aircraft guns and fighters that Franco had asked for, but a full squadron of Junkers transport planes to airlift the Spanish Army of Africa from Morocco. "1,500 of these troops were transported to Seville to begin their fighting passage to Madrid. These crack troops of the Spanish army were to play a decisive role in the war. Hitler said later that Franco should erect a monument to the Junkers 52, the aircraft that Franco had to thank for his victory. Hitler might have congratulated himself too. His help was later rewarded with a constant supply of Spanish iron ore. This gave him a great advantage in his preparations for the World War that was to follow. But in 1936, most people still thought that war could be avoided. In 1936, Mussolini had not yet become Hitler's pawn. Indeed, many British hoped Italy could become an ally. But Mussolini's conquest of Abyssinia had already shown that he was preparing aggressive expansion. He wanted to turn the Mediterranean into what he called Mare Nostrum, our sea, another Italian lake. There was a natural challenge at the entrance to that lake. Throughout the 30s, Mussolini had dabbled with small-scale right-wing plots to subvert Spanish democracy. He had modestly financed the leader of Spain's fascist party, José Antonio, and allowed right-wing military groups to train on Italian soil. In 1934, in a written though informal agreement, Mussolini had promised to supply arms to Spanish monarchist conspirators should they overthrow the Republic. When the time came, after the uprising, he supplied 12 bombers, the first foreign military hardware to arrive in Spain's war. While Germany and Italy supported the army rebels, Léon Blum, the French Prime Minister of the recently elected Popular Front government, naturally identified with the Republican government of Spain. Léon Blum feared France's isolation. Still haunted by the terrible French losses in the 1914-18 war, and already flanked by 2 fascist powers, France certainly did not want to be trapped in a fascist triangle. Blum went to London to discuss plans for a collective security treaty with the British. Before he went, he ordered that arms be sent to Spain. At this meeting with Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, Spain was not officially on the agenda, but Blum discussed it anyway. On his return to Paris, he reported the conversation to Jules Moch, a member of his government.
Blum told me of his talks with Eden. Et la position extraordinairement extra-européenne. And the extraordinary non-European stance that both Eden and his colleagues were taking. Eden told Blum we shouldn't get mixed up in it, that even if war broke out in Europe over Spain, England, who was distant from all that, would remain neutral. Therefore, since France could not count on support from England, it would be wise for her to adopt the same position as the English. And I think I can recall that Blum told me that that would be a cowardly position.
In London, the British national government was worried. Conservative Prime Minister Baldwin and his ministers were concerned at all costs to avoid another world war and feared it could start in Spain. Alec Douglas Hume was then a backbencher.
If country after country began to take part in the war, then nobody could see the end of it. And it could end up in a big European conflict. Mussolini was careering around in the Mediterranean and making all sorts of trouble. Japan was restive. And of course, German realm was in full flood. And so we were very apprehensive about getting entangled in any other situation.
Britain's attitude didn't help the French Prime Minister Léon Blum. His plan for keeping European peace by protecting Spain was also in trouble at home. His policy of unrestricted military sales had threatened to split his government and might have precipitated serious civil unrest. He therefore reversed his original decision to send arms to Spain and devised another policy to save his face. On August 2nd, the French cabinet announced that they had decided to appeal urgently to interested governments for a pact of non-intervention. The British government, supported at this stage by its Labour opposition, responded eagerly.
I think France and Britain felt exactly the same on this issue. We did not want to get embroiled. And Mr. Blum thought of the policy of non-intervention, which wasn't a heroic policy at all. But nevertheless, it was a pragmatic policy.
As France closed its borders, the Spanish Republic felt let down. Under international law, it was legally entitled to buy arms abroad, but non-intervention stopped that. No one had ever claimed heroic intention for the policy. It was a diplomatic stratagem, a framework in which everyone could safely pursue their individual ends. They would fight their battles without actually going to war. No one thought it could curtail hostilities in Spain, or even that it should. Spain provided a safety valve to siphon off the political passions of Europe at that time.
Adesso quando si dice fascista si pensa alla violenza, alla dittatura. Però allora
nowadays when you say fascist, you think of violence or dictatorship. But at that time, we youngsters didn't know anything else. We had been brought up and educated under fascism. We were convinced that it could be a valid formula to solve social problems.
risolvere I problemi sociali, soprattutto del mondo.
Not all Italians were so convinced. Giovanni Pesci had been brought up in France. His parents had fled there to escape Mussolini's Italy.
The fight for the Spanish people was also a fight against Italian fascism. This was the reason I came voluntarily to fight in Spain.
La Pasinaria, whose real name was Dolores Ibarruri, was a communist member of the Spanish Parliament. Her rhetoric rallied worldwide support for the Republic.
Era venuta la Passionaria a Parigi.
La Passionaria had come to Paris to ask for support, for help from the French people and the French government.
del pueblo francés para con el pueblo español. Que el pueblo francés no olvide que la lucha que en estos momentos sostiene el pueblo español es la lucha por la paz, es la lucha por la libertad.
She finished her speech by saying, if Spain is defeated, the world will be flooded with blood. And so I, a young, very young, militant of the anti-fascist movement, said that I must also go to give my contribution.
In Germany, communists had been the first target of Hitler's terror. And so when Hitler made clear his support for Franco, German communists knew which side they were on.
I believe that for us German anti-fascists, it was more poignant than for anybody else. We had tangibly experienced Hitler. Thousands of German anti-fascists were already in prisons and concentration camps, and we immediately recognized the connection between Franco's intentions and those of Hitler.
The politics of economic depression spilled over from the cities of Europe to a full-scale battlefield in Spain. It was mainly communists who travelled to do the fighting. Frank Deegan was an unemployed communist docker from Liverpool.
I believed that if Hitler and Mussolini managed to help Franco to win, then this would be a defeat for the whole labour movement throughout the world. We thought, you know, the fascists of the world were ganging together, so a call went out for volunteers to help the Republican government.
The call came from Moscow. The International Committee of Communist Leaders, the Comintern, organized an international column of volunteers. Stalin himself, however, had his doubts. He was wooing Britain and France as allies against the Nazi threat and didn't want them scared off by communist intervention in Spain. He held back from sending arms. He did send advisors, ambassadors, and food. When the first Russian ship arrived in Barcelona, initial rapture gave way to disappointment when the consignment turned out to be not the guns that the Republic wanted, but canned milk. The guns only came later. Meanwhile, the Italian Foreign Minister, Giano, met Hitler at Berchtesgaden in Germany. They agreed that their aid to the Spanish army rebels had to be increased, partly to counter Russian aid, and partly because Hitler had now decided he wanted to go over to the attack against the democracies. What had previously been a reflex action, a decision to supply Spain on request, became a concrete policy, a joint front against communism. A few days after Ciano and Hitler's meeting, Mussolini was heard for the first time to refer to the Rome-Berlin axis. Events in Spain had drawn Italy and Germany closer together, a step down the path towards the Second World War.
I hate war.
The world was very different in 1936. America was not the fulcrum of the world's foreign policy decisions. Still in dogged isolation from Europe's affairs, Roosevelt ignored the Spanish conflict and allowed the Texas Oil Company to supply Franco with fuel. In London, the non-intervention powers examined allegations of Italian, German, and Portuguese intervention. The committee was chaired by the British. No one wanted the charges to stick, and they didn't. Von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, later joked, a more appropriate name for the organization would have been the Intervention Committee. Nowhere was this intervention clearer than in the battle for Madrid. Until October, the skies were dominated by the rebels, reinforced by German and Italian planes. The Spanish Republican Air Force was no match until Soviet planes arrived.
Just before the Soviet aid arrived, I'd seen a demonstration of women marching along the Gran Via, the principal street in Madrid, shaking their fists at the German and Italian planes and shouting, "No pasarán, they shall not pass." 2 weeks later, there was another flight of planes over Madrid. This time they flew very low and dropped no bombs. Everyone looking up from the streets suddenly saw that they were no longer Germans or Italians, they were Russian planes. And the cry went up that ran right through the city, son nuestros, they're ours, they're ours.
One day we were surprised to see some new machines in the sky, and we saw these small ones with snub noses. They flew around at a tremendous speed and shot down a nationalist plane occasionally. People began to get excited, started shouting, "Long live Russia." They started to hug each other.
Just 15 weeks after the start of the war, the Republic's capital, Madrid, was on the front line. The rest of the Republic lay behind. The army rebels held the territory north and west of the capital. Their land offensive began on November 7th. With only 25,000 men, the Nationalists were attempting to capture a city of 1 million inhabitants. Franco had made ready lists of people to be arrested. Having met little resistance so far, he could not have anticipated the stubborn reaction of the Madrid people. No pasarán, they shall not pass, had become the slogan of Madrid, and indeed of all Republican Spain. The government on the Largo Caballero left the capital for the safety of Valencia. So did many of the population. For those who stayed, some preparation to defend the city had already been made. General Miaca, one of the army officers who stayed loyal to the Republic, led the defense junta in charge of the overall political and military control of Madrid. Miaca and his staff officers were joined by Communist Brigade Commander Enrique Lista.
The population had been prepared politically to receive the enemy with boiling water, with oil, with anything that came to hand, from their balconies and roofs. The defense of Madrid was more thanks to the people of Madrid than to the militias.
Entonces esta gente se incorporó a la lucha, pero sin pasar por casa. Salieron del comercio.
People joined up at once. They didn't even bother to go home. They were given some hand grenades and a rifle, and with their ordinary jacket and trousers, they got into waiting vehicles or into a tram and went off to fight. This was really striking and wonderful. It was one of the most wonderful moments of the war.
Everyone in Madrid was involved. Loyal officers staffed the army. Ordinary people built defenses for the city. Political parties recruited men for defense militias. But most of all, an organized army was created. However barely trained and equipped, 10 new brigades of the popular army of regular soldiers, mixed with volunteers, were naturally a more effective fighting force than the old militia columns. The people's resistance was stiffened by the approach of Franco's troops and by potent propaganda.
Madrid, corazón de España, late con pulsos de fiebre. Si ayer la sangre le hervía, hoy con más calor le hierve. Ya nunca podrá dormirse, porque si Madrid se duerme, querrá despertarse un día y el alba no vendrá a verle. No olvides, Madrid, la guerra. Jamás olvides que enfrente los ojos del enemigo te echan miradas de muerte. Rondan por tu cielo halcones que precipitarse quieren sobre tus rojos tejados, tus calles, tu brava gente.
Wir in fernen Vaterland geboren, nahmen nicht als harten Herzen mit.
For 2 generations, the Spanish Civil War has been remembered for the international brigades. This fighting force of 40,000 men was a unique expression of international solidarity. There were Frenchmen, Greeks, Poles, Italians, Americans, Canadians, Irish, Czechs, Australians, Swedes, Swiss. There were 2,000 British, 500 of them died. But the war was already 4 months old, and Madrid under siege by the time the first organized volunteers arrived in the city to take up positions at the front. One of the first battalions was predominantly German. It was named after Ernst Thälmann, the leader of the German Communist Party, who was in a Nazi concentration camp at the time.
They took us straight to their hearts. They knew why we'd come. They had one slogan for us all, "Long live Russia." They treated us as if we were Russians, and only slowly they got to realize we were Germans. So far, Madrid had been bombed by Germans, the Condor Legion, and now suddenly there were Germans on their side.
With a background of military service, a life of resistance to persecution that bred political discipline, these German communists were an example to the Spanish.
For me, seeing them brought the joy of solidarity and warmth. They left a profound impression on me. Also, they showed us the things we had to learn, what discipline is, what an army is. Until then, we'd been a militia, not a regular army.
Not all Republicans were so happy about the volunteers. In Catalonia, some anarchists feared their revolution was being taken over by communists. They arrested a party of international brigaders arriving from France. But in Madrid, everyone was grateful for any relief from the enemy. The international brigaders were rushed up to the front to help their Spanish allies resist the rebel army attack. There was fighting in the Casa del Campo, a park on the western edge of the city. On November 15, 1936, the rebels finally broke through Madrid's defenses at a point in the university campus overlooking the park. The international brigades held the line in the philosophy faculty, but 2 days later the rebels attacked again and occupied part of the clinical hospital. The Thälmann battalion found themselves defending one floor of the hospital from the Moors on the floor below.
We were on the 3rd floor. We'd knock holes in the ceiling, and then we'd throw hand grenades down to clear them out. In this fight, there was hardly ever a real front, a front which was clearly defined.
Eventually, the line stabilized, and Madrid held out. So Franco tried a new tactic. The Civil War became a testing ground for modern weapons. It was a foretaste of what was to happen a few years later in London, Hamburg, Tokyo, and Leningrad. But until now, no city in history had been so sorely tested. Scenes like this on newsreels all over the world confirmed the sympathy that attracted so many people to the Republic. Journalists like Ernest Hemingway went to report and became propagandists. The original complex Spanish causes of the war were distilled into the poetic certainties of right and wrong. Wogan Phillips, now the only communist in the British House of Lords, went to drive an ambulance. Stephen Spender, the English poet, went with him to look.
We are obsessed by the feeling that this is the supreme cause of our time, a cause of poets and of writers, the cause of freedom, and that unless the cause of anti-fascism was won, unless fascism was defeated, we wouldn't be able to exist as writers.
Like so many British radicals, Spender at that time was a member of the Communist Party, but he represented the liberal wing of English intellectual thought.
I think there was a later generation of John Cornford and Julian Bell who got killed in Spain, who felt that they wanted to submerge their literature, their independence of mind as intellectuals, even their existence as intellectuals, which seemed subjective to them, within the objectivity of Marxism.
This was the generation of Philby and Maclean. Philby was in Spain for a while, working as a Times correspondent with Franco's forces. In fact, he was spying for the Russians. Julian Bell had developed his Marxist ideas at Cambridge, in the same secret society, the Apostles, which included Anthony Blunt. The threat of fascism had turned a generation of English intellectuals into communists. The brutal realities of Stalin's Soviet Union had not yet been made known. Some people like George Orwell, however, who had gone enthusiastically to fight for the Spanish Republic, came to appreciate in Spain the danger of all-pervasive totalitarian communism. He joined the anti-Stalinist party, the POUM. The persecution of the POUM by the official communists disillusioned many who thought the Republic was a democracy. Most volunteers, though, were communists, and those who weren't felt isolated.
I remember going to the front near Madrid once and meeting a young man there who was an English public school boy, and he said to me, well, you know, I came to Spain and joined the International Brigade because I understood it to be a liberal Republican organization, and what I found is that it's an entirely communist organization. And then he said, I would spend the rest of my life every day walking up to that ridge that you can see a few hundred yards away, and that'll be the end of me. And he certainly was disillusioned, although he accepted this, and he was killed within 6 weeks.
But for many Spaniards, the Soviet Union's support seemed a salvation. In 1937, Teresa Pamias was a member of the Socialist Youth.
I és que la Unió Soviètica ens ajudava. Era el país que venia armes al govern legítim de la República.
The Soviet Union sold guns to the government of the legitimate republic. Guns came to Barcelona in their ships. It brought us this feeling of mythical togetherness, which became very solid.
This comradely solidarity had a hard business edge. All the arms were paid for. Spanish gold reserves had been sent to the Soviet Union. They supplied the arms. Political influence came with them. In Madrid, morale was sustained by showing epic Soviet films like Kronstadt, celebrating the defense of the Soviet Revolution of 20 years earlier. But the Soviet influence was not revolutionary in Spanish terms. On the contrary, the Communist Party's disciplined approach to fighting the war and keeping order attracted large sections of the middle classes in the Republican zone. They had been frightened by the rival anarchist revolutionary ambition for the Republic. At the end of 1936, Stalin wrote to Largo Caballero and argued in diplomatic French that the Republic should collaborate with liberals and conservative peasants. It is necessary to prevent the enemies of Spain considering her a communist republic, he said. Stalin, remember, still needed Britain and France on his side. They were still not his certain allies against the threat of Hitler. And in Spain, Hitler's intentions were becoming clear. His ambassador formally recognized the Franco regime during the battle for Madrid, and now Hitler could hardly afford to let the rebels lose. Germany increased its aid and sent instructors to train nationalist officers. This gave Franco's rebels a useful but still not decisive advantage. The nationalists were holding about 60% of Spain, but they were short of troops and had stalled on a front of 1,200 miles. In spite of a dangerous bulge around Madrid, the Republic was holding its ground. The nationalist sponsors became impatient, particularly Mussolini. Without even consulting Franco, he began to send large numbers of Italian volunteers to Spain. Their first battle was at Malaga. It was an easy victory. It shortened the front and raised nationalist morale. The nationalists now tried to encircle Madrid, first from the south by crossing the Jarama Valley. Republican reinforcements, including international brigaders, were rushed up to the front line. After 10 days, the battle had spent itself, with heavy losses on both sides. There immediately followed another attempt to encircle Madrid, this time from the north at Guadalajara. The Italians, supremely confident after their victory at Malaga, persuaded Franco to let them fight alone. On the Republican side, the Italians from the Garibaldi battalion of the International Brigades took up position against their fellow countrymen.
Questa era la posizione del battaglione Garibaldi.
This was the position of the Garibaldi battalion. Headquarters was near the woods. The fascists were here, all in this area.
Poi verso le 11 mezzogiorno vediamo passare due macchine.
Then, at about noon, we saw two cars go by. We stopped them and they said to us, "But we are Italians." We answered, "We're Italians too."
Giovanni Pesci and his comrades had found just what they had come to Spain for, the opportunity to fight Italian fascists.
They started to raise their hands, very worried, and began to cry, "Don't shoot us, we are Italians too. It's not our fault if Mussolini sent us here. They told us they were sending us to Abyssinia." We took them prisoner and took them to the command.
When the Republican troops routed the Italian opposition, Mussolini was furious. He decided that no Italian could return home until they'd won a victory. Foreign aid on both sides poured into Spain at a faster rate than ever before. But it was not enough to clinch the war, only to prolong it. And Madrid was now a stalemate. It remained so until the end of the war, 2 years later. So the nationalists switched their offensive to the north. The western part of the Basque country was still Republican. It had been separated from the main Republican zone since the early days of the war. This northern region was a potentially valuable prize on account of its heavy industry and mineral wealth. It was a special region in other ways. Here conservatives were fighting side by side with anarchists and socialists. The Basques gave the lie to Franco's claim that his campaign was a Christian crusade. The region is the most devout Catholic area in the country. Here people prayed for victory against the nationalists. Their opposition to Franco and support for the Republic came from the traditional Basque yearning for the home rule of their region, so distinctive from the rest of Spain. The Liberal Republic recognized that ambition, but the nationalists who believed in the unity of Spain were determined to crush it. The attack began on March 31st. The nationalist, General Moller, threatened to raze the region to the ground. He nearly succeeded. But first, the nationalists tried to starve the Basques into submission. The sea blockade of Republican ports posed an embarrassing problem for Britain. Several British merchant ships, legally commissioned to deliver food supplies to the Republic, were stuck in the French port of Saint-Jean-de-Luz. The British government was reluctant to challenge Franco's navy by supplying escorts for their merchantmen. Despite outcry from the House of Commons, Eden announced that British ships would be protected only outside a 3-mile limit of Bilbao. At the same time, the British were secretly negotiating with the Nationalists for the output of British-owned mines in Spain. On April 19, 1937, a Captain Roberts, the master of one of those ships, the Seven Seas Prey, became anxious to leave Saint-Jean-de-Luz before his cargo rotted. Captain Roberts defied the British order and set sail for Bilbao. His daughter, Fifi, was on board.
So 10 o'clock we darkened ship and pulled up anchor and sailed out. Frantic flashings from the shore, and a searchlight was played on us, but Father was doing a Nelson act, you see, he just shut that eye, and we sailed on. I mean, there's nothing to it.
In spite of the warnings of the British government and the threats that Bilbao harbour had been mined by the Nationalists, the Seven Seas Spray arrived unscathed and sailed up Bilbao River.
We were the first in, and were told there's only 4 days' food left for the people. Everybody was cheering, hooters were going. It was rather like a ticker tape reception. Only we were coming up the river and everybody was hanging out from all their windows and waving and cheering. It was quite emotional.
Captain Roberts and Fifi became the Basque people's heroes. The Seven Seas Spray had exposed the Nationalist blockade as a myth, and other British merchant ships followed with food supplies. But the Basques couldn't celebrate for long. "10 miles behind the front line was the small market town of Guernica, with a population of 7,000. It was the historic centre of Basque nationalism. The tree of Guernica, the symbol of Basque freedom, stood beside the Parliament building where traditionally all Spanish monarchs had sworn to uphold Basque liberties. April 26, 1937, was Market Day.
The market was held where the public gardens of Guernica are now. Everything was normal, but then the planes came in the afternoon.
Doña Ignacia Otamid lived in Guernica with her 2 daughters, Connie and Manoli.
We were in the industrial zone, and over the hills opposite, I saw the planes arriving. First, just one of them. It circled twice, but we were used to seeing it do that and fly away again. But scarcely 10 or 15 minutes later, more arrived, and we were able to count them. There were 8, all in a line, black. I remember them as very black and ugly.
I'll never forget the noise the bombs made. A kind of fizz, followed by cries. Then a tremendous crash, over and over again. I can still hear the noises, and we could feel everything tremble. Smoke and heat came in.
43 aircraft, mainly German, took part in wave after wave of attacks on the small town. Karl von Kanar was the squadron leader of the Condor Legion which bombed Guernica.
This had no impact on me. I conducted these attacks and operations in the course of my duties as a soldier, carrying out my orders without heed for my life. At the time, we thought we were fighting a war against communism.
The Condor Legion might have believed the Catholic Basques were communists, but the Spanish High Command who ordered the attack knew otherwise. For both of them, Guernica's cultural significance was more or less irrelevant. It was a military target. There was a small arms factory, and Republican soldiers retreating from the Nationalist attack had to pass through the town to reach the last line of defence round Bilbao. The Germans claimed their instructions were to bomb the bridge and crossroads at the edge of Guernica in order to make the road to Bilbao impassable. In 3 hours, 100,000 pounds of incendiary, high explosive and shrapnel bombs were dropped on the town. Little remained standing, except the arms factory and the Germans' main target, the bridge.
We could clearly see that the wind blew the bombs onto the fields. They missed the bridge and the houses by it. The Junkers were really commercial airplanes converted into bombers. That is, they were equipped with what we called a pot slung underneath the plane. It could be retracted during takeoff and landing and lowered during flight. And the poor observer had to climb down a tiny ladder into this contraption with his goggles and his flying helmet on. And there he had a primitive targeting device and rangefinder.
The Germans' excuses don't explain why they did not use accurate Stuka dive bombers to destroy their objective, the bridge at the edge of Guernica, nor the fact that they machine-gunned the fleeing population, nor the magnitude of the whole operation.
I can still remember, and I was just 9 years old, the force of the blast of heat in my face as I came out. All the buildings next to the factories were burning, everything on fire. The sky was red with reflections.
2 days after the bombing, Fifi Roberts was taken with her father to see the devastation of the town. 45 years later, she returned to Guernica to revisit the scene she had photographed with her own camera.
Along the road, there were streams of refugees trudging along. I don't think they had any idea where they were going, what they were going to do. They were on carts, wheelbarrows, anything that had a wheel that was being pushed, and a few of their belongings on it. It's rather heartbreaking to see. And then when we got into Guernica itself, there wasn't a building standing. There's rubble all over the place. Nobody to be seen except the odd soldier. I think they'd been still looking in the ruins for bodies. Luckily, we didn't see any, but the place was an absolute shambles.
72 hours after the raid, before the reckoning of destruction could be completed, the rebel army arrived at Guernica. They immediately began a propaganda offensive as well, making show of guarding the famous Basque Tree of Liberty. They even tried to put the blame on the Basques for destroying their own town.
Cierta prensa aseguró que esta desgraciada ciudad fue destruida por la aviación nacionalista. La trabación de hierro del frontón y los bidones de gasolina acumulados frente a la iglesia demuestran que fueron patrullas de incendiarios quienes echaron sobre sus hombros la tristísima misión de arrasar la pintoresca cuna del fuerismo vasco.
Some people were even prepared to believe this. The Nationalists' real prize lay ahead. To protect their rich industries, the Basques had built a defensive wall around Bilbao, a ring of iron. But it could not protect the city from intensive bombing. With Bilbao about to fall, the Western democracies finally felt free to help. The children of Republican Spain were catalogued, given medical inspections, labeled and transported to England, France, Belgium, America, and the Soviet Union. Franco soon broke through Bilbao's defences and seized the region's industries and mines intact. Soon ships left Bilbao with new cargoes. Soon Franco was exporting iron ore. His clients included Germany and Britain. Both countries were to use the captured resources of the Republic for their own rearmament program. Non-intervention, either real or phony, didn't interfere much with business or prevent the world war that was to follow.